Okay, I've been thinking more about this idea that monopolies require states. Okay. Now let's set aside for the moment the idea that we need to or can figure this out from a historical analysis because everything's mixed up, right? We've had businesses overlapping with war profiteering organizations with authority, both granted to them and taken by force, mostly the latter, slavery. We've had all of this stuff mixed up in our history. So we always argue about, I'll give an example of a monopoly that happened back when we had a more laissez-faire economy. And you'll say, oh, but look, there was collusion with government. Well, of course, because the government existed and it's, bought, bought and paid for. So let's just forget that. Let's just think of like a simulation, okay? And just logical definitions, okay? As far as I know, I'm going to introduce some terms, and you can introduce terms afterwards to make the system more apt in some way, which you'll have to say why it's more apt, okay? But to me, all I need for a monopoly is the idea of property, okay? That I can control something and nobody else can use it without my permission. And two, a finite amount of property, okay? A finite amount of property. Obviously, there's a finite amount of property, um, both in general, but also in a specific area. And we have to consider locality. Like I said, there's a finite, depends on the criteria when we're saying is there a finite amount of property. I mean, for example, to get in, if I own 10 acres and there's 100 acres surrounding it that I don't own, you know, that is a property, a specific type of property that I need in order to get to and from my property. So there's a finite amount of that. Okay, so there's a finite amount. So that's all we need is that there's a concept of property, and so the concept of property and a finite amount of the property, and you could have a monopoly in certain areas or even overall in all property. Okay. Now, at least in all transferable property. Okay. Now, if if we're not in a, if we all agree we're not in an anarchic system right now, and we're saying, well, let's go to one, then there's going to be some initial conditions, right? Well, in this model where you have finite property, the idea of property, and that there's a finite amount of it, obviously I can create monopolies, right? I can obviously create monopolies just by picking initial conditions where one person has all of a particular resource. Let's say all the water rights to the whole planet. If we're picking the initial conditions, I can choose that, and a monopoly like that would never be broken, right? I think we could agree on that. Okay. Now, the question is, are there any initial conditions whereby monopolies wouldn't form? Any initial conditions where you don't grant a monopoly to begin with the initial condition, where monopolies are sure not to form. Now, I think because of the locality problem, monopolies are sure to form. The only way to assure that somebody can get to and from their property and cannot be landlocked is to just say so, to have some general body that has the authority to impose that and say, yes, somebody can get to and from their property. You have to let them. Okay. But maybe there's some initial conditions, if you were running this as a simulation, some initial conditions where that would be the case. Um, I think a lot relies on the initial conditions of starting your anarchy up. And I would like to know one, you need to add a principle that shows me why there's an initial condition uh, that that there's an initial condition where the system will never develop monopolies. Okay. And you can also tell me how government is in there. What's the hidden variable in this thing where government is part of the idea of property and that there's finite property? How is government required to have a monopoly? In other words, to create those initial conditions does not create, does not involve a government. I mean, in the sense, intellectually, in that none of the terms I've used in this very simple idea of property and finite amounts of it, is there the idea of government, unless you think that governments are required in order to have a concept of property, which would be an odd assertion, considering who I'm arguing against here. So, so what kind of initial conditions would it take? And I think obviously they'd have to be fairly distributed to begin with. And this is the thing I've used in this idea of my deal to market anarchists. How would you dispose of what is currently governmental property? I mean, I think the only fair way to do it is you can't have the government sell it off. No. Everybody that's a citizen of the United States, for example, would own some of the government's property, because that's what supposedly is the case now. If we privatized it, we'd have to say, okay, well, that's a private thing. We'd all get our share and our vote, and it would become a corporation which we were stockholders in. One share per citizen or something like this. Now, given that, I think what you'd see happen is that we'd run that shared property pretty much like the nation is run now. And, you know, we still own all the parks and the roads, and you can't go out on the roads unless we say you do have a right to do it. And so it's kind of funny, because I think we could get you to pay probably even higher taxes, considering how much we control all the resources to and from your property, but just with governmental property. And if you think there should be some other way of doing it, well, you're talking about the pragmatics of an initial condition. What is the initial condition? How do we start up the system? Obviously, we can't start it up with people that have monopolies to begin with, so how do we start it up?